The world's most iconic sunglasses weren't born in a fashion studio. They were born in a war zone, and before they became a billion-dollar symbol of cool, they were part of a secret military experiment, an experiment that almost blinded a pilot and changed eyewear forever. This is the story of how aviation challenges, extreme conditions, and science came together to create Ray-Ban, the sunglasses that started as protection gear and became a global obsession. It all began in the 1920s, a time when humans were just beginning to conquer the skies. Aviation was still new, still risky. Airplanes were fragile machines made of wood and metal, and pilots were often seen as the ones flirting with danger.
Aviation pioneers, 1920-1930s. The modern airplane creates a new geographical dimension, a navigable ocean of air.
But as flight technology advanced, pilots started flying higher and higher than anyone thought possible. And that's when something unexpected happened. At extreme altitudes, the air was thin, the sun was brutal, and the glare was blinding. Pilots reported intense headaches, nausea, and even vision blackouts mid-flight. Their eyes were literally burning. The U.S. Army Air Corps, worried that their best pilots were being harmed by the very skies they were meant to conquer, decided to act. They approached one of America's oldest optical companies, Bausch & Lomb, based in Rochester, New York, and gave them a mission: create something that can protect a pilot's eyes at high altitude. But here's where it gets strange. This wasn't just a simple eyewear request. The Air Corps was already running a psychological study, a kind of early human stress experiment on how isolation, fear, and sensory pressure affected pilots who flew for hours alone in open cockpits. They wanted to understand what made men lose focus under pressure. Inside those studies, pilots were placed in controlled environments, altitude chambers with freezing air and artificial sunlight to simulate the experience of being 30,000 feet above ground. And during this study, one pilot in particular became a case that would change everything. And that pilot was Colonel John Macready. He had flown for hours in a blinding sky, and when he landed, his eyes were swollen, bloodshot, and nearly blind. He could barely see light. Doctors said it wasn't just exhaustion, it was exposure to ultraviolet radiation, magnified by the thin air at high altitude. And this case triggered the invention of a lens unlike anything before. Using flight data and stress studies from isolated pilots, Bausch & Lomb scientists began experimenting in their labs, and what they realized was something nobody had formally studied before. First, the mind and eyes were connected. Second, too much light didn't just damage the eyes, it shattered concentration, distorted perception, and triggered disorientation. And third, the most important, to survive high-altitude missions, soldiers didn't just need physical armor, they needed psychological armor. So the lab began developing it. Their first prototypes looked more like goggles than glasses, bulky, rubber-sealed eyewear with green-tinted mineral glass lenses. But these weren't random colors. Bausch & Lomb found that the specific shade of green filtered out ultraviolet and blue light frequencies while maintaining contrast and clarity. It reduced strain on the optic nerve, allowing pilots to read instruments and scan horizons without losing focus. The idea was simple: block the harmful rays, reduce mental strain, and prevent sky blindness. And the results were revolutionary. Pilots who tested them reported something remarkable. Not only could they see better, but they felt calmer, sharper, more in control. The glasses didn't just protect their eyes, they steadied their minds. And then came a breakthrough in the lab. Engineers used anti-glare coatings, a new technique then to reflect light off the surface instead of absorbing it. That meant less heat, less reflection, and sharper visibility in sunlight. What's even more fascinating is that their findings indirectly influenced NASA decades later. Early astronaut visors used similar polarization principles, descendants of Bausch and Lomb's original Ray-Ban research, to protect the eyes of space pilots from solar radiation. And after years of R&D, the final design of these glasses was released for military use in 1936 and for the public in 1937. And it was called Ray-Ban. It literally meant ban the rays. It was functional, precise, and perfectly built for service. But within months, something unexpected happened again. People outside the military started noticing these glasses. Celebrities, adventurers, and wealthy travelers began wearing Ray-Ban. And why not? The design was minimalist, confident, and so cinematic that it shouted authority. Ray-Ban, the product of a military psychology study, was quietly transforming into a fashion statement. But the story didn't stop there. In the 1940s, when World War II happened, Ray-Bans suddenly started appearing.
The first aviator sunglasses were made by Ray-Ban for World War II pilots. These guys needed glasses similar to fighter pilot goggles that would eliminate sunlight and glare. To pull this off, Ray-Ban designed the iconic teardrop frame.
U.S. generals wore them during briefings. Fighter pilots wore them on missions. And perhaps most famously, General Douglas MacArthur, when photographed landing in the Philippines in 1944, wore his Ray-Ban Aviators. That image, stern calm, composed under chaos, was published in newspapers across the world. From that moment, Ray-Ban became not just eyewear, but an identity for the masses. Yet, most people didn't know where that identity came from. They didn't know it was born out of fear, out of a military study that tested the limits of human endurance in isolation and pain. They didn't know that what they saw as style was originally designed to stop men from going blind and breaking down mentally in the cockpit. As the war ended in 1945, Ray-Ban had already crossed into pop culture, and Hollywood noticed it. By the 1950s, the company released a civilian version of the original Ray-Ban called the Ray-Ban Wayfarer, sleek, black, and made for the post-war generation. But this was no accident. Ray-Ban knew that after years of destruction, the world was craving confidence again. People wanted to feel powerful, untouchable, just like those pilots once did. And Ray-Ban sold exactly that feeling. In every photo, from movie stars to musicians, the message was the same. Power hides behind glass. And then came the golden era. In 1955, James Dean wore them in Rebel Without a Cause. Audrey Hepburn wore them in Breakfast at Tiffany's in the 60s. And then came the phenomenal moment when Tom Cruise wore Ray-Ban in Top Gun, giving them the literal worldwide craze. And it made Ray-Ban sales skyrocket by over 40%. Interestingly, even NASA test pilots in the 1960s, men training for the Mercury and Apollo missions, were known to wear Ray-Bans off-duty, not because they needed them, but because they liked what they symbolized. Calm under chaos, eyes hidden, mind unshaken. But here's the irony most people don't realize. The glasses that made Tom Cruise look untouchable were originally made for pilots trying not to panic. The calm, confident stare Ray-Ban became famous for was literally engineered to stop soldiers from losing focus under pressure. Think about that for a second. The design of these glasses wasn't born out of vanity. It was born out of fear. Fear of blindness, fear of weakness, fear of losing control. And maybe that's what makes them timeless. Every era has its own kind of battlefield, from war zones to boardrooms to red carpets, and Ray-Bans became the armor people wear when they need to feel composed. But the story has one more twist. In the 1990s, Ray-Ban almost died. The brand that once symbolized rebellion had become outdated. Cheap copies flooded the market. And by 1996, sales had dropped so low that department stores refused to stock them. The once mighty Ray-Ban worn by generals, icons, and movie stars was practically invisible. And then, something unbelievable happened. In 1999, the company was sold to an Italian eyewear giant called Luxottica for just $640 million, and Luxottica decided to rebuild it from the ground up. They changed the material, replacing heavy glass lenses with lighter, more durable ones. They redesigned the frames, brought back the original aviator silhouette, and, most importantly, they revived its mythology. They reminded the world where Ray-Ban came from. They leaned into its war-born legacy. It's linked to aviation, rebellion, and psychological strength. They stopped selling sunglasses and started selling a story. And it worked. By the 2010s, Ray-Ban was back on top, worn by world leaders, actors, musicians, and even tech CEOs. It wasn't just a brand anymore. It was a cultural language, a way of saying, I'm in control. And yet, behind that cool exterior still lies the ghost of that pilot, the one who once couldn't see, the one whose pain forced scientists to find a solution. So the next time you see someone wearing Ray-Bans, think about this. Those dark lenses weren't actually made to block sunlight. They're shielding something deeper, the universal need to look strong, even when you're breaking inside. Ray-Bans were born not out of luxury, but survival. Not out of fashion, but fear. And that's what made them powerful. Make sure you subscribe to Seriously Interesting. And if you want to know how a dentist accidentally invented the world's most addictive food, watch this video.